The streets of downtown Atlanta shimmered under the cold glow of streetlights. It was past midnight, and the city was alive in its own way, bars closing, cabs weaving through the streets, and the occasional pedestrian making their way home. Officer Richard Kane sat in his patrol car, sipping on a lukewarm coffee, his partner Tom Harris beside him. The radio buzzed intermittently with reports of minor disturbances, but nothing that required their attention. Then, Kane spotted it, a black man driving a sleek, black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, cruising down the avenue like he owned the world. Something about it irritated him. Maybe it was the way the man carried himself, exuding confidence that Kane found arrogant. Maybe it was the way he was dressed, an expensive tailored suit that looked like it cost more than Kane's yearly salary. Or maybe, deep down, it was something more insidious, something Kane never admitted to himself. "Look at that," Kane muttered, setting his coffee down. Harris followed his gaze. "What? Guy in the Benz. Probably a dealer. Nobody like that drives a car like that unless they're moving weight." Harris frowned. "Man, we don't have probable cause." "Don't need it," Kane said, already flicking on the patrol lights. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, the driver obeying immediately. Kane smirked. Guilty people always obey fast. He stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his belt, making sure his gun was positioned just right. His boots echoed against the pavement as he approached the driver's side window. The man inside was composed, hands resting on the wheel at 10 and 2. The interior of the car was immaculate, real leather, high-end wood trim, no sign of drugs, no smell of anything illegal. Kane didn't care. "License and registration," he barked. The man looked at him with calm, piercing eyes. There was no fear in them, no anxiety, just quiet confidence. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" he said, voice deep, measured. Kane bristled. "Because I told you to. Now hand over your license and registration." The man didn't move immediately. "Is there a specific reason? Was I speeding?" Kane's jaw clenched. "Step out of the car." The man sighed but complied, moving with a controlled grace that irritated Kane further. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, Kane shoved him roughly against the car, kicking his legs apart. "Hands on the hood," Kane ordered. The man didn't resist. His suit jacket stretched against his broad shoulders as he leaned forward. Kane patted him down roughly, harder than necessary. He wanted to find something, anything that would justify his instincts. "Got a name?" Kane asked. "Michael Carter." Kane scoffed. "That's supposed to mean something?" Michael turned his head slightly. "Not to you. Not yet." Kane didn't like the way he said it. He didn't like the certainty in the man's voice, like he knew something Kane didn't. "You got drugs in the car, Michael?" Michael exhaled through his nose. "No." Kane glanced at Harris. "Search it." Harris hesitated. "We don't have a reason." "I said search it." Harris sighed and moved toward the car. Michael remained motionless, staring straight ahead as Kane tightened the grip on his shoulder. "You know," Kane sneered, leaning close to his ear, "guys like you think you can dress nice, drive a fancy car, and people will just forget what you really are. But I see through the act." Michael turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Kane's. There was no anger in them, no fear, just an eerie kind of patience. "You should be careful," Michael said softly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Kane smirked. "Yeah? And who exactly am I dealing with?" Michael didn't answer. That was the moment Harris returned. "Car's clean," he muttered. Kane's smirk faltered. Michael straightened. "Are we done here?" Kane wasn't ready to let it go. He needed to prove something to Harris, to himself. So, without another word, he grabbed Michael by the back of the neck and shoved him to his knees on the pavement. "Stay there," he spat. Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't resist. Kane could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric. He had done this 100 times before, to dozens of men like Michael, but for some reason, this time felt different. "I promise you," Michael said quietly. This is going to cost you. Kane laughed. Yeah? We'll see about that. And he had no idea how right Michael was. The moment Michael Carter walked out of the precinct, he pulled out his phone. He had remained calm the entire time, not because he wasn't furious, but because he knew the power he held. Unlike most men in his position, he had the resources to do something about it. The call went through instantly. This is Carter, he said. Initiate Protocol Black. I want full surveillance on Officer Richard Kane. I want his history. I want his finances. I want every complaint filed against him. And I want it now. The response on the other end was immediate. Understood. Director. The line went dead. Michael exhaled and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He adjusted his cufflinks, looking back at the police station one last time before stepping into his car. Richard Kane had made a mistake tonight, and he was about to learn just how big of a mistake it was. The next morning, Richard Kane walked into the precinct as if nothing had happened. He had roughed up plenty of people in his career, and it had never come back to bite him. But today felt different. As soon as he stepped inside, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations hushed when he passed. A few officers avoided eye contact. His captain, a grizzled man named Reynolds, stood in the hallway, arms crossed. Kane, my office. Now. Kane frowned. What's up, Cap? Reynolds didn't answer. Inside the office, Reynolds shut the door and tossed a folder onto the desk. Kane picked it up. Inside were reports, old complaints, footage, statements. Kane felt his stomach tighten. What the hell is this? Reynolds sat down. You tell me, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone just took a wrecking ball to your career. Kane flipped through the pages. Every incident of excessive force, every wrongful stop, every justified shooting that had barely been cleared. It was all there. And there was more. His bank records, his text messages. How? Reynolds leaned forward. Who the hell did you pull over last night? Kane swallowed hard, because now, he was starting to understand. Michael Carter wasn't just some rich guy with a nice car. Michael Carter was someone who could destroy him, and he had already started. The news broke that evening. Video footage of Kane forcing Michael Carter to his knees. Audio of the things he had said. It was all over national television. And that was just the beginning, because Michael Carter wasn't just fighting for himself. He was about to expose everything Kane had ever done. And this time, there was nowhere for Kane to hide. Richard Kane sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of the television screen casting flickering shadows against the walls. Every channel, every news website, every social media platform was covering the same story. Atlanta police officer under investigation for racially motivated assault on CIA director. The words felt surreal, like they were about someone else. Not him. He had been in this line of work for 15 years. Had done worse things without so much as a slap on the wrist. And now he was the target. His phone vibrated again. Another message from an unknown number. You're finished. The anonymous texts had been coming in since the story broke. Some threatening, some mocking. He had ignored them at first, but they were starting to crawl under his skin. His own colleagues were avoiding him. The usual camaraderie in the precinct had evaporated overnight. The few cops who still talked to him spoke in hushed tones, making sure no one else overheard. A knock at his door made him flinch. Kane stood up cautiously, grabbed his gun from the coffee table, and approached. He peered through the peephole. Tom Harris. He exhaled sharply and opened the door. Harris stepped inside quickly, glancing around as if making sure no one had seen him. Jesus, man. He muttered. Have you seen the news? This is bad. This is really bad. Kane locked the door behind him. No shit. They're digging up everything. Your old cases, your financials, even your personal life. Someone's pulling strings. Hard. Kane ran a hand through his hair. It's him. Harris frowned. Who? Kane's jaw tightened. Michael Carter. He's not just some random guy. He's the fucking CIA director. Harris paled. You're kidding. I wish I was. Kane sat down heavily on the couch. He's going to bury me. Harris looked around nervously. We need to get ahead of this. You have connections, people in the department. Lawyers. Politicians. They're all running for cover. Kane snapped. Nobody wants to be associated with me right now. I'm toxic. Harris hesitated. Maybe you should just apologize. Kane's head snapped up. Apologize? You think that'll fix this? Harris sighed. I don't know, man. But right now, Carter's got the power. You don't. For the first time in his career, Kane felt truly powerless. And he hated it. The next morning, Kane arrived at the precinct and immediately felt the shift in energy. Conversations stopped when he walked in. Officers avoided his gaze. Even the front desk sergeant, who usually greeted him with a nod, barely acknowledged him. As he made his way to his desk, he spotted Captain Reynolds standing near his office. Arms crossed, their eyes met, and Reynolds motioned for him to follow. Kane's stomach twisted as he entered the office. Reynolds closed the door and let out a deep sigh. Sit. Kane remained standing. If this is about. You're suspended, Kane. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. For how long? Kane asked, voice tight. Indefinitely. Kane's hands clenched into fists. You're throwing me under the bus? Reynolds sighed. This isn't just about you. The department is under fire. Protests are breaking out. The mayor is involved. The governor is asking questions. This is bigger than you now. Kane shook his head in disbelief. So that's it? I'm done. Reynolds hesitated. If the investigation goes south, you might be looking at charges. Kane's face turned red with fury. For what? Doing my job. Reynolds' expression hardened. Your job? Your job isn't to brutalize people because of the way they look. And sure as hell not someone like Michael Carter. Kane's heart pounded. You're scared of him. I'm respecting the fact that he has more power in one phone call than you'll have in your entire goddamn life. Kane's vision blurred with rage. But deep down, he knew Reynolds was right. He stormed out of the office, past the stairs, past the whispers. The moment he stepped outside, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. Officer Kane, do you have a statement? Do you regret your actions? Will you resign? Kane pushed past them, his mind racing. He had lost his badge. Now, he had nothing left to lose. Michael Carter sat in his office, watching the news unfold. The chaos he had orchestrated was playing out exactly as planned. His assistant entered. Sir, Kane has been suspended. Michael didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. This was only the beginning. Has the financial report come in? His assistant nodded and handed him a folder. Yes, we've confirmed offshore accounts, cash payments, and unreported assets. It's all here. Michael flipped through the pages. Richard Kane wasn't just a racist cop, he was a dirty one. Bribes, illegal seizures, kickbacks from drug busts. The evidence was overwhelming. Leak it, Michael said, handing back the folder. His assistant hesitated. This will destroy him completely. Michael met her gaze. Good. His assistant nodded and left. Michael leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He remembered every second of that night, the cold pavement beneath his knees, the weight of Kane's hand on his neck, the hatred in his voice. Kane had expected him to be just another victim. But Michael Carter never forgot. And he never forgave. Richard Kane woke to the sound of his phone ringing. He groaned, rubbing his face as he answered. Yeah, you need to get online. Now. It was Harris. His voice was urgent. Kane sat up, grabbed his laptop, and pulled up the news. There it was. Suspended Officer Richard Kane under investigation for corruption. His entire history exposed. The bribes, the stolen evidence, the secret payments. Someone had found everything. No, 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 Kane muttered, scrolling frantically. Harris's voice came through the phone. It's Carter. He's taking you apart. Piece by piece. Kane's hands shook. He had thought losing his badge was the worst thing that could happen. But now, he realized Carter wasn't just out to ruin his career. He was out to ruin his life. And Kane had nowhere left to hide. Richard Kane sat in the dark of his apartment, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating his face. His world was crumbling around him. And no matter how many times he refreshed the news sites, the headlines didn't change. Former Atlanta officer Richard Kane under federal investigation for corruption and civil rights violations. Anonymous source leaks financial ties between Kane and criminal enterprises. Everywhere he looked, his name was being dragged through the mud. His so-called friends weren't picking up their phones. The police union, which had always shielded its officers from accountability, had distanced itself from him. No press conferences, no statements in his defense. They had thrown him to the wolves, and now they were watching from a safe distance as he was devoured. His phone vibrated. Another unknown number. You should run. His fingers tightened around the device. He wasn't the type to run. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. But now, sitting alone in his apartment with his gun on the table beside him, he wasn't so sure anymore. A sudden pounding at his door made him jump. He grabbed the gun instinctively and crept toward the peephole. Outside, in the dimly lit hallway, stood Tom Harris, looking over his shoulder nervously. Kane unlocked the door and yanked it open. "What the hell are you doing here?" Harris shoved his way inside, locking the door behind him. His face was pale, eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to be watching. "Jesus, man, you look like shit," Harris muttered. "No thanks to you," Kane snapped. "Where the hell have you been?" Harris exhaled sharply. "Listen, I need you to hear me out. They're coming for you, Kane. And I don't mean just the department." Kane frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Harris swallowed hard. "It means Carter isn't playing by the usual rules. This isn't just about getting you fired. He wants you ruined. He wants you behind bars. And I think—" He hesitated, voice dropping to a whisper. "I think he wants you dead." Kane's stomach twisted. Harris continued. "There are people poking around, looking for anything they can use against you. And it's not just journalists or IA. I'm talking about guys who don't have badges." Kane's grip tightened around his gun. "You're saying the CIA is after me?" "I don't know," Harris admitted. "But Carter isn't just a bureaucrat. He's a ghost. People don't go after someone like him and walk away from it." Kane took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had always been the predator, the one in control. But now, for the first time in his life, he was prey, and he didn't know how to stop what was coming. Michael Carter sat in his office at Langley, staring at the live feed of Richard Kane's apartment. His intelligence team had eyes on every aspect of Kane's life now: his phone, his bank accounts, even his private conversations. Every move he made, every person he contacted, was being tracked. Carter had watched the footage of Tom Harris sneaking into Kane's apartment. He had listened to their conversation. Good. He wanted Kane to feel the fear creeping in. He wanted him to understand that his time was running out. His assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, we've confirmed the federal indictment is moving forward. Charges will be announced by the end of the week." Michael nodded. "And the assets?" "All of his accounts have been frozen. His mortgage lender has been contacted. He'll be evicted within the month. His car is already marked for repossession." Michael leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "And what about him?" She hesitated. "Still no signs of him leaving the city. But he's becoming more paranoid." Michael exhaled slowly. "Good. Let him spiral." There was a knock at the door, and another agent entered, carrying a tablet. "Sir, you'll want to see this." Michael took the device and watched the footage. It was grainy, taken from a street camera outside Kane's apartment. A black SUV had been parked down the street for hours. The license plate was fake. The men inside, their faces partially visible, weren't law enforcement. They were something else. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. Someone else was hunting Richard Kane. And it wasn't him. Kane paced the length of his apartment, gun in hand. Everything was falling apart. His bank accounts had been locked. His lawyer had dropped him. The police department had disowned him. And now, Harris was telling him that there were people watching his every move. His phone buzzed again. This is your last chance to disappear. He clenched his teeth. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. He grabbed a duffel bag and started shoving essentials inside: cash, burner phones, extra ammunition. He wasn't stupid enough to stay in one place any longer. If Carter wanted to take him down, he'd have to work for it. As he zipped up the bag, the lights in his apartment flickered. Then, the power went out. Kane froze. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't a coincidence. He moved to the window, peering through the blinds. The black SUV was gone. But that didn't mean he was alone. He checked his gun, took a deep breath, and made his way toward the back door. As he reached for the handle, there was a loud bang. The front door was kicked open. Kane spun around just in time to see two men in tactical gear storm in, rifles raised. He fired. The first shot hit one of them in the chest, but his vest absorbed it. The second man tackled Kane to the ground, knocking the gun from his hands. Kane fought, thrashing, punching, clawing. But these weren't cops. These weren't some street thugs. They were professionals. One of them cracked a baton against Kane's ribs. Pain exploded through his side. Another blow landed against his head. His vision swam. Then darkness. Kane woke to the sensation of cold steel against his wrists. His head pounded. His ribs ached. He was tied to a chair. In a dimly lit warehouse. The air smelled of oil and dust. A single figure stood in front of him. Michael Carter. He was dressed in a crisp black suit. His expression unreadable. Kane blinked, trying to focus. Wah! Carter tilted his head. Are you starting to understand yet? Kane swallowed hard. You set this up. Carter smirked. Oh, Richard, if I had set this up, you wouldn't be breathing right now. Kane's heart pounded. That meant they weren't my people. Carter continued. Which means you've made more enemies than just me. Kane's mind raced. Who? Carter stepped closer. His voice quiet, measured. You spent your entire life thinking you were untouchable. That your badge made you invincible. That no matter what you did, the system would always protect you. He leaned in. Welcome to the real world. Richard. No badge. No backup. Just you. Kane's breathing was ragged. Michael straightened. I could end this right now. Kane tensed. But I won't. Michael continued. Because there's something worse than death. Richard. His eyes burned cold. It's knowing that your time is running out. And that when it finally does, no one will come to save you. Carter turned and walked away. The door shut behind him. And Kane was left alone, trapped in the darkness. Richard Kane sat in the cold darkness of the warehouse, the sting of blood drying on his temple, his ribs aching with every breath. His wrists were raw from struggling against the zip ties that bound him to the chair. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the vast space around him. He had no idea how long he had been here. Hours, maybe more. Time had begun to stretch and blur, his mind teetering between adrenaline and exhaustion. Michael Carter's words still echoed in his head. There's something worse than death, Richard. It's knowing that your time is running out, and that when it finally does, no one will come to save you. Kane had spent years believing in his own invincibility. He had worn the badge like armor, knowing that no matter what he did, the system would always shield him. But now, sitting here alone, bruised and powerless, he felt something he had never truly experienced before. Fear. It was a slow, creeping thing, like ice forming in his veins. The door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of dim light across the concrete floor. A man entered. Not Carter this time. Someone else. He was tall, dressed in dark tactical gear, his face obscured by shadows. Unlike the men who had taken Kane before, this one moved with careful, deliberate steps like a predator studying his prey. Kane straightened, forcing himself to mask the pain in his expression. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a chair from the corner of the room and placed it directly in front of Kane, sitting down with a slow, measured grace. "You've made a lot of enemies," the man said finally, his voice deep, almost amused. "Some of them are willing to pay a great deal to see you disappear." Kane's pulse quickened. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" he pressed. "You're not working for Carter. Someone else wants me dead." The man leaned forward slightly. "Not dead. Not yet." A chill ran down Kane's spine. "Then what the hell do you want?" The man tilted his head. "I want you to understand." Kane's jaw clenched. "Understand what?" The man's voice was calm, but there was something deadly beneath it. "What it feels like to have your power stripped away." Michael Carter sat at his desk, staring at the encrypted file that had just arrived on his private server. The surveillance team had traced Kane's abduction to a group unaffiliated with any known law enforcement agency. They were something else, something older. Carter had spent years dealing with the shadows of government agencies, black ops teams, and mercenary groups. But this was different. They weren't just after Kane. They wanted something else. His phone buzzed. "Sir." His assistant's voice came through, tense. "The men who took Kane, they're ghosts. No names, no affiliations, no digital footprints. But we found something else." Carter exhaled. "Go on." "They have connections to private security firms, the kind that handle disposal jobs." Carter's fingers tapped against his desk. "So someone put out a contract on Kane." "It looks that way. And sir," there was a brief hesitation, "this wasn't recent. This contract has been open for months. Someone's been waiting for him to be vulnerable." Carter's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. Kane had thought Carter was his biggest problem. He had no idea that he was already marked for death long before this war between them had begun. Carter stood, adjusting his cuffs. "Find him, sir. Find Kane before they finish what they started." Kane sat in the chair, his wrists still bound, but his mind working furiously. He had been in tight situations before, but never like this. Never without the system to protect him. The man in front of him stood up slowly. "You don't seem scared enough." Kane forced a smirk. "That's because I don't know who the hell you are." The man chuckled. "Does it matter?" Kane's stomach twisted. He had no leverage, no badge to flash, no legal loophole to slip through. If these men wanted him dead, he was dead. But they weren't killing him. Not yet. That meant they wanted something. "You're not here to execute me," Kane said, watching for a reaction. "If you were, I'd already be dead." The man said nothing, "Which means someone wants me alive. The question is, for how long?" The man finally spoke. "That depends on whether you cooperate." Kane scoffed. "Cooperate how?" A door opened behind him. Footsteps. More men. A laptop was placed on a table in front of him. The screen flickered on, revealing grainy footage. His old cases, his arrests, his brutality caught on camera. A different kind of fear settled in his gut. They weren't just here to kill him. They were here to make him confess. To make him destroy himself before the world did it for him. Michael Carter arrived at the location his team had tracked down. A remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city. His men were already in position, weapons ready, but he held up a hand. This wasn't a battlefield. Not yet. He approached the entrance, the steel door groaning as it swung open. Inside, Richard Kane Saturday slumped in a chair, his face bruised, blood staining the collar of his shirt. Carter stepped inside, his shoes clicking against the cold concrete. The room was silent except for Kane's ragged breathing. He looked up, blinking against the light. When he saw Carter, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not hatred, recognition. Kane understood now. He had been playing checkers while Carter had been playing chess. Carter took a step closer. How does it feel? Kane let out a bitter chuckle, his voice hoarse. Like losing. Carter studied him for a long moment. You could have walked away that night. You could have chosen differently. Kane exhaled. And what? Let someone like you win. Carter's jaw tightened. Someone like me? Kane didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence stretched between them. You know what comes next. Carter finally said. You confess. Publicly. You tell the world exactly who you are and what you've done. Kane scoffed. And if I don't? Carter's expression was unreadable. Then I let them finish what they started. Kane stared at him, searching for a way out. But there was none. He had spent his entire life making other men feel powerless. Now, for the first time, he knew exactly what that felt like. And there was no escape. Richard Kane sat in the dimly lit warehouse, staring at the laptop screen in front of him. The footage playing was a montage of his worst moments, arrests where he had used excessive force, grainy body cam clips of him sneering at civilians, leaked internal memos showing complaints that had been quietly buried. It was everything he had spent years denying. Everything he had told himself was justified. Michael Carter stood beside the laptop, watching Kane's reaction with a quiet intensity. He had seen this before, the moment when a man realized the walls had closed in. When he understood there was no more running, no more excuses. Kane exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. So this is it. Huh? Public execution. Carter tilted his head. No, not public. Not yet. This is your chance to tell the truth before the world rips it from you. Kane scoffed. What truth? That I was just another cop doing his job? That I didn't wake up every morning looking to ruin someone's life? Carter's voice was steady. But you did ruin lives. You don't have to intend harm to cause it. You think the people you humiliated and beat down care about your intentions. Kane's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to fight back, to deny everything. But he couldn't. Not anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. Carter slid a phone across the table. You're going to make a statement. Kane looked at the phone like it was a loaded gun. And if I don't? Carter's expression didn't change. Then your past speaks for you. And this doesn't end with your career, Kane. It ends with your freedom. Kane let out a bitter laugh. So I either destroy myself, or you do it for me. Carter didn't answer. The silence stretched between them. Kane looked down at the phone, his fingers hovering over it. He thought about his life before all of this. The power, the respect, the certainty that he was always in control. And now, all of it was gone. With a shaking breath, he picked up the phone and started recording. The video hit the internet that night. A shaky, low-lit recording of Richard Kane, sitting in a chair, his face bruised, his eyes hollow. I'm Richard Kane, former officer of the Atlanta Police Department. He began, his voice hoarse, and I need to tell the truth about what I've done. He spoke for 7 minutes. He admitted to everything: racial profiling, excessive force, planting evidence to justify arrests. He named other officers who had done the same, revealed how complaints had been swept under the rug, how the system had protected men like him for years. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. When the video ended, there was nothing left for him to hide behind. The fallout was immediate. The police department scrambled to issue a statement, distancing themselves from Kane, promising reform. Protests erupted outside the precinct, fueled by the long-simmering rage of a community that had been ignored for too long. And behind the scenes, Carter's people worked to ensure that Kane wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. An hour after the video went live, federal prosecutors announced an official investigation. The trap was complete. Kane had confessed, but he wasn't free. Not yet. Richard Kane sat in the defendant's chair, dressed in a suit that no longer fit quite right. The courtroom was packed: reporters, activists, former colleagues who now pretended they had never known him. He was facing multiple charges: civil rights violations, corruption, abuse of power, the kind of charges that didn't just end a career, but a life. His lawyer had advised him to plead guilty. It was the only way to get a reduced sentence, but the words tasted like poison in his mouth. He glanced over his shoulder. Michael Carter sat in the gallery, watching him with the same quiet intensity as always. Kane swallowed hard and turned back to the judge. "Guilty," he said. The word echoed in the courtroom, final and absolute. His hands trembled as the judge began speaking, but he barely heard the words. His mind was elsewhere, flashing through memories of his career, the men he had shoved to the ground, the people he had humiliated, the power he had wielded so carelessly. Now, he was the one with his back against the wall. He was sentenced to 20 years. When they took him away, he didn't look back. Michael Carter stood on the steps of the courthouse, the weight of the moment pressing against him. Kane was going to prison, but this wasn't just about one man. This was about an entire system, a deeply embedded rot that wouldn't be removed with one conviction. A reporter pushed a microphone toward him. "Director Carter, do you think this verdict will bring real change?" He exhaled slowly. "It's a step," he said carefully. "But justice isn't about one case. It's about ensuring this never happens again." The reporter pressed further. "Some say you took personal revenge on Kane, that this was never about justice, but about power. What do you say to that?" Carter met her gaze, his voice calm but unwavering. "Power doesn't mean anything if you don't use it to protect those who need it. Kane wasn't my revenge. He was a reminder." The reporters kept shouting questions, but Carter was done talking. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You did what had to be done, but there will always be more." Carter slipped the phone back into his pocket and stared at the city skyline. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But tonight, at least, one chapter had closed. And tomorrow, a new battle would begin.